On behalf of the Wheatley Institution and the David M. Kennedy Center for International Studies, I welcome you to this evening's distinguished lecture in international affairs. Our speaker this evening is Dr. Khaled Abou El Fadl, who's on the Faculty of Law at UCLA. I'll do a more formal introduction in just a minute. The best feature of my current position here in the Wheatley Institution is that I get to meet and spend time with and host some wonderful people. And I just want to thank each of them one more time, not only for the fine scholarly presentations, but for their personal friendship, the spirit that we have felt from each of them. I feel, I'm planning in the hereafter to be judged by my friends, and I'm hoping to include each of these people on my list at the proper time. But we hope also that they have felt our love and our appreciation, and that they will consider themselves to have a home here whenever they'd like to come back and spend some time with us. Dr. Khaled Abou El Fadl is one of the world's leading authorities on Islamic law and a prominent scholar in the field of human rights. He is the Omar and Esmeralda Alfi Distinguished Professor in Islamic Law at the UCLA School of Law, where he teaches international human rights, Islamic jurisprudence, national security law, law and terrorism, Islam and human rights, political asylum and refugee law, and political crimes and legal systems. That's only in his spare time, I think. He is also the chair of the Islamic Studies Interdepartmental Program at UCLA. Among his many honors and distinctions, Dr. Abou El Fadl was awarded the University of Oslo Human Rights Award, the Leo and Liesel Edinger Prize in 2007, and named a Carnegie Scholar in Islamic Law in 2005. He was previously appointed by President George W. Bush to serve on the U.S. Commission for International Religious Freedom, and also served as a member of the Board of Directors of Human Rights Watch. A prolific scholar and prominent public intellectual, Dr. Abou El Fadl is the author of 14 books, 5 forthcoming, and over 50 articles on various topics in Islam and Islamic law. He has lectured on and taught Islamic law throughout the United States and Europe in academic and non-academic environments for over 20 years. Dr. Abou El Fadl is most noted for his scholarly approach to Islam from a moral point of view. He writes extensively on universal themes of humanity, morality, human rights, justice, and mercy, and is well known for his writings on beauty as a core moral value of Islam. He is one of the foremost critics of Puritan and Wahhabi Islam. His most recent works focus on authority, human rights, democracy, and beauty in Islam and Islamic law. His book, The Great Theft, was the first work to delineate the key differences between moderate and extremist Muslims, and was named one of the top 100 books of the year by Canada's Globe and Mail. His book, The Search for Beauty in Islam, a conference of the books, is a landmark work in modern Islamic literature. I was told yesterday, I'll just add this, that he was named one of the 100 most influential, I believe that, did I get that number right, Professor Abou El Fadl? Muslims in the world, as I recall. Dr. Abou El Fadl holds a BA in Political Science from Yale University, a JD from the University of Pennsylvania Law School, and an MA and PhD in Islamic Law from Princeton University. He is also an Islamic jurist and scholar, having received 13 years of systematic instruction in Islamic jurisprudence, grammar, and eloquence in Egypt and Kuwait. It is our pleasure to welcome to the Wheatley Institution and BYU Dr. Khaled Abou El Fadl.
Thank you so much. It's an honor for me to be with you. I've met so many generous souls Sorry. So many generous souls in my visit, and to this I'm extremely appreciative. I exist in a field of study that the simplest of virtues, including that of basic human decency and trust, is becoming rather a scarce commodity. So when I am in an environment such as this one, it is extremely heartwarming and reminds me of what keeps me fighting in this field and struggling to get the point across. It's an odd time to be a specialist in Sharia. It's fair to say that at a personal matter, but across the board, as to all Muslim specialists in Sharia and even broader in Islam, it's a time where you can hardly make a presentation, publish a book, unless it is remarkably academic and inaccessible to the public, without somehow raising some extremely strong feelings one way or the other. It's become, even now as my own graduate students, well known that wherever you go, you sort of have a band. Instead of a band of admirers or fans, you have a band of doubters and persistent credibility, people who cast doubt on your credibility, and accusers and hate mongers that follow the discourse, the narrative of a Sharia expert in today's world. I leave the existential responses to this type of ugliness to the chapters of the Conference of the Books, which is where I put out my soul, at least in the book that I've published, and maybe another volume to come, maybe. But with you, I have to admit that there is a certain, you see this whole effort with a certain level of bemusement and as particularly peculiar. Sharia as an ancient, and I'll talk about what I mean by Sharia and all of that, but for now, Sharia as an ancient, lived legal system that has existed for at least 1,400 years. Some say, give or take a couple of hundred years. Historically speaking, it's nothing. You're talking about a remarkably complex reality, but yet this complexity has entered into the common discourse that we live in, to the point that it's quite common to step into a bookstore and find best-selling specialized treatises that claim to be expert works on either Islamic theology or Islamic law, and that have play the particular function of warning fellow Westerners or fellow Christians or fellow Jews, as the case may be, of the threat that Islam and Islamic law pose to humanity, to civilization, to peace, to whatever the psychological trope used a psychological trope used by the author. And I'll give you it even more concretely. When there's a book that I'm not necessarily encouraging you to read, but from my perspective at least, it's amusing. There's a book. It's supposed to be a report. It's published by the Center for Security Policy. It's called Sharia: The Threat to America, an exercise in comparative analysis. Then it has some official sounding designations. Report of Team B, Roman numeral 2, etc., etc., and in which the report engages in an exposition on the hidden truth about Sharia. And from that report, we are told that Muslims, by the nature of their legal order, by the nature of the moral universe in which they dwell, by the nature of their spiritual commitments, can only deal within a paradigm of what the authors call dhimmitud. Again, borrowing from another bestseller about Muslims and their relations with non-Muslims. And by that they mean that Muslims can only look at others as inferior to themselves and will never accept to be equal in worth or power, and can only relate to others from a position of dominance and superiority. And it goes on to say also that part of the moral universe in which Muslims dwell is, and they pluck, like all Suda experts, they love to pluck Arabic words. So they pluck a word called taqiyya, and they say that they are duty-bound to lie to protect their interests in their theology and their law. It is a moral act to lie, etc., etc. Of course, they won't tell you about the Muslim jurist who wrote famously in a very influential work that, by God, if I hear a voice from the sky telling me that God has approved lying, I would not lie, and I would not consider lawful to do so. The report limits itself to sources or no sources. Now, that doesn't matter, the report itself, except for the fact that, lo and behold, we live in an age in which 14 states currently have passed anti-Sharia legislation, and in all 14 states that have passed legislation banning local courts from considering or implementing Sharia. Now, mind you, as a lawyer, I've got to tell you, it's nothing more than a symbolic act of bigotry, because in the United States we have something called the Supremacy Clause. We have rules of conflict of law rules, which means that on issues where foreign law is concerned or international law is concerned, it's not states that get to make their own laws, but principles of comity and reciprocity give exclusive jurisdiction to the federal courts and to the federal government. So in other words, and do the makers of these anti-Sharia legislation, the ones that tell local courts, you may not implement the foreign law of Sharia in the state, do they not know this? No, they actually know this, and they know this quite well. But they know that in all likelihood, if the law is challenged, the whole field will be considered preempted by the federal government, and these legislations would be simply a rhetorical exercise. But that's exactly the point, is to engage in the rhetorical exercise of going through the motions of saying, here are the symbol representations of foreignness, alienness, and threat. Now, when we read that in a certain state, such legislation passed by a 70% vote, you can't say that these are marginal dynamics anymore. It's a fair bet that most of those who voted on the anti-Sharia legislation are not experts in Sharia and know next to nothing about the history or the tradition or the discourses and so on. But it doesn't matter. I'll give you one other example. Enrollment in my own Islamic law class at UCLA. Interestingly, at a time in which in Los Angeles there was a movement led by Campus Watch type folks to get something, I think they hoped it would materialize in something like an anti-Sharia legislation. But at the time that the anti-Islam and anti-Sharia discourses were at a high in Los Angeles, it was also the time in which enrollment in my Islamic law class was absolutely the lowest. And that's quite telling. It's when people hate the most, when they fear the most, is the time when they know the least and want to know the least. And that's critical to what I want to share with you today. Neither Sharia nor Islam nor the dynamics between Islam and the West, there's nothing new under the sun. Islam and the West have experienced each other in completely artificial categories. And let me elaborate what I mean by artificial categories. What stands for Islam is a huge plane of potential and actual manifestations. You know, it ranges from the Ja'faris of Iran to the Zaydis of Yemen, to the Ibadis of Oman, to the Ismailis of Fatimid Cairo, to the Ismailis of India, to the Ahmadis of Pakistan. The huge rubric of Islam, however loosely conceptualized, and the equally vague and nebulous construct, the West, which includes Protestants, Catholics, the French, no comment. You know, and then the problematics, you know, South Africa under white rule, Israel, depends on who you talk to, whether, and especially what their politics are, and then these colonial realities like New Zealand and Australia and so on. But whatever the West is, both have been not just in dynamics with each other and interaction with each other for centuries, but they have been actively constructing and inventing and reinventing and reconstructing each other for centuries as well. At no point in the history of Islam was the construction of Islamic theology or the polemics of Islamic theology or even the construction of Islamic law exist in a vacuum from its surrounding historical contextual reality. So, to put it in blunt terms, from the get-go, the very moment of conception and birth for Islamic law, there was Roman law, there was Jewish law, there was Persian law, there was Sassanian law, and no matter how often dogmatists and polemicists try to pretend that this context was irrelevant, it does not fly. Because real experts can study early Islamic law and clearly find points of contact and points of differentiation, a continuing narrative going on between the Islamic reality from the very beginning and its surroundings. And the same is said of the West. At no point since the birth of Islam has the West defined itself without reference to the, however constructed, the Muslim reality and however perceived, to the point that some historians have argued that the very idea of the West was born in response or in antithesis to, or as a response to, the spread of Islam and competition with the Eastern Orthodox Church as well, i.e. Byzantium Empire. But, that gets very murky and very complicated. But even whether we accept this historical analysis or not, what everyone will agree to is that there constantly are points of tension, but points of coalescence, and an ongoing narrative in which the Muslim and the non-Muslim is constantly defining the other and the self, and redefining the other and the self. Now, whatever existed in history, in the history of the birth of Islam, in the history in the confrontation with the Byzantine Empire, in the history of removing the Persian threat to the Byzantine Empire, in the history of the re-emergence of the Persian threat in an Islamized garb, in the history of the entry of the Turkic tribes and the Islamic formula and Islamic equation and so on, in the ongoing up and down complicated history that is the nature of the complicated beings of God, because God chose to give us free will, and that's the nature of things. You get free will, and next thing you know, people make up their own mind about things, and things get very complicated. And that's just the reality. But in this ongoing history, if points of contact were pertinent to a 1 degree 1,400 years ago or 1,000 years ago, points of contact multiply tenfold, 100-fold in today's world, in the world of overlapping cultures, of an increasingly humanity struggling for breathing space in which individuality can exist, because we simply cannot formulate meaning in today's world without that meaning traveling overnight to friend and foe alike and becoming part of the reality that they react to or they share. So if we reacted to and created each other and invented each other in the medieval period, even much more so today. And this ongoing process of engaging and inventing and reinventing and imagining and reimagining leaves us with one of the consequences of God's creation and free will, and that's moral agency. The moral choice at different points to determine how you construct the other and construct the self at the same time. How you choose to react to the symbolic representation of the other and define yourself vis-a-vis the symbolic. So one person can see a muhajjaba and can say, oh, that's really interesting. I would like to know more. Another person can see a muhajjaba and say, oh my God, how oppressive. It's a symbolic emotive reaction that emerges primarily from the fact of moral agency, and here it's theology more than psychology, that it is the moral agency that gives you that choice to define your reaction. So, when I read a report like the one issued by Center for Security Policy, Sharia, the Threat to America, and I know that this report played a predominant and heavily influential role in the anti-Sharia legislations of all 14 states. And not only that, but there is one proposed law now in Tennessee that would make it a criminal offense to advocate, teach, promote Sharia, punishable by 15 years in prison. Now, will it pass? Well, it depends on moral agency, the moral choices that people make every day as they react to the other and define the self and the other. I've been involved in several cases that has tried, or the legal argument, whether it is a dispute over profit, non-profit position, whether it's religious Islamic institutions fall within certain city ordinances or not. Consistently, the argument or these cases try to litigate over and over whether Islam is an ideology or Islam is a faith. And consistently, a certain type of lawyers, I don't know why, but they always wear not a tie, but bow tie. I'm not sure why, but I see a bow tie, I kid you not, I see a bow tie and I say, it's going to be a nasty time in court. And their argument is always, yes, you think you believe in a religion, but you don't. You really believe in an ideology, and it's an ideology of hate and exclusion, and therefore, whatever liberties or whatever is provided by the Equal Protection Clause of the U.S. Constitution applicable to freedom of faith and religion, it should not apply and does not apply to Muslims or to Islam because under the argument Islam is an ideology and not a religion. And again, if we would try to identify a single emotive response that is the cause for not just a misunderstanding, but the insistence on misunderstanding, the insistence on knowing what you think you already know. I mean, there are one emotional response to knowledge and to always feel like I don't know, and that's sort of your emotional response is extreme insecurity towards every bit of knowledge that confronts you, and a passionate desire to know. Or a different response is that you look for knowledge that affirms and confirms what you already think you know. And frankly, even among Muslims or non-Muslim students, I mean, I always tell students the worst of you, and the ones that I don't want to supervise as graduate students, are those of you who are constantly looking for affirmation for what you already believe you know, and read everything within that selective prism. Anyway, what singular emotion can we identify? I would submit it's a shade of anxiety and fear, which many have said is at the heart of most prejudice, most bigotry, the most immoral type of reactions. Now, so going back to the issue of dynamic and interaction and self-definition, the moral choice to either react and define yourself vis-a-vis the other in terms of anxiety and fear, as opposed to in terms of self-confidence and a search for communalities, has always been there. And it is an affirmative moral duty upon the present day academic mind, scholarly mind, and even citizen of the world to choose the right side between these two primary emotive responses. Fear with a desire to protect the self and ward off the other, or self-confidence and a desire to share for commonalities. I want to share with you a quote that has always fascinated me because of the dynamics of anxiety and fear, but also what it tells about the construction of the other from a purported 9th century source. This is the Bishop of Cordoba complaining about the new faith that was spreading in Spain. And he's complaining about his fellow Latinos or fellow Christians and saying, and the quote begins, "Many of my co-religionists read verses and fairy tales of the Arabs." Of course, what he means by Arabs are really Muslims, because they included Berbers, who are not Arabs. But nevertheless, the source says Arabs. "Many of my co-religionists read verses and fairy tales of the Arabs. Study the works of Mohammedan philosophers, Muslim philosophers, and theologians, not in order to refute them, but to learn to express themselves properly in the Arab language more correctly and more elegantly. Who among them studies the Gospels and the prophets and the apostles? Alas, all talented Christian young men know only the language and literature of the Arabs, read and assiduously study the Arab books. If somebody speaks of Christian books, they contemptuously answer that they deserve no attention whatever. Woe, the Christians have forgotten their own language, and there is hardly one among 1,000 to be found who can write to a friend a decent greeting letter in Latin. But there is a numberless multitude who express themselves most elegantly in Arabic and make poetry in this language with more beauty and more art than Arabs themselves." Now, reflect about this quote, the type of anxiety it expresses, but also the type of response that it complains about that turns out, at this point, it was known as the response of the Mustaribs, those who imitated Arab culture but never converted to Islam and remained Christian. And later on, somewhat inaccurately called the Muzarabs of Spain, those who, again, Arabized Christians. It's, in honesty or in truth, they were heavily influenced by Islamic culture but remained Christian rather than Muslim. Now, notice the reaction of the Mustaribs or the Muzaribs, as opposed to the reaction of this clergyman. The Bishop of Cordoba, who authored this quote, eventually leads to a movement of such anxiety about Arabs and Muslims that it ultimately leads to the banning of everything that comes by the way of Arabs and Muslims, including all Latin texts that were translated by Arabs and Muslims. And this plunges the world into Europe, first of all, but even outside Europe, into a dark age in which thousands lost their lives in religious wars. There was a second response which eventually actually plays a critical role in the Renaissance, and that is the response of the Mustaribs or the Muzaribs, who, while remaining anchored in their Christian faith, learned everything there is to learn from this civilizationally superior at the time culture. And far from being threatened by it, embraced it with absolute confidence. And later on, it took centuries, but they actually turned out to be the saving grace of the Western civilization. Even among today, you can reverse the roles. the Bishop of Cordova could have been an imam writing in a mosque, saying that today everyone speaks English. They can hardly compose a letter in Arabic. Everyone converses and reads English and so on. And that is at the heart of the Islamic puritanical extremist response to the perceived threat from the West, and as well at the heart of the non-Muslim response to the perceived Islamic threat that comes from people such as those who authored Sharia, the threat to America. In all of this, there is the persistence of moral agency and choice. Do you react with fear and a desire to set boundaries and domains of exclusion? Or do you react with a level of faith? Now I'll use faith instead of self-confidence. With a level of faith, a search for commonalities, ultimate belief in whatever your system of belief in, but a belief in the essential, basic humanness of, or the nature of human beings. If you are a researcher today, you can choose to write a narrative. I'll take in my field. If I'm writing in law, I can choose to write a narrative of Islamic law that goes something like this. There was Abraham, there was Moses, there was Jesus, there was Muhammad. Muhammad received the Quran created Islamic law, and Islamic law is a determinative system or a way of life, a complete and total social order that is contained within itself, and basically in a consistent process of exclusion and self-definition for the Muslim and exclusion of the other. And if that's the moral choice I choose to ignore a great deal of historical narrative, a historical narrative of various points in which Islamic law articulated very legal categories in which it expressed itself, such as the notion of abode, the abode of Islam versus the abode of whatever, which was an essential part of the way that the Roman Empire divided the world and defined the world, and Islam simply responded to that. Now, if I am a non-Muslim writing, let's say, the history of the common law, I can choose to do for instance, someone called Monica Galdiosi, who's since have left the legal field and abandoned academia, perhaps for good reason, I don't know, who wrote a very well-researched work on how the institution of trusts, legal trusts, that played a fundamental role in the development of the common law were directly influenced by the same concept 300 years earlier in Islamic law. Or the work of someone like John Maqdisi, who wrote of the development within the Islamic civilizations of the inns of courts, which were adapted from a basic Roman institution and then reabsorbed into the common law, and played a critical role in the development of what we know as the common law. If you study the history of interaction between Islam and the West, you can choose to focus on a history of confrontation, and, for instance, to choose to focus on the Reconquista, the lowest point of Muslim, non-Muslim interaction, the point in which morality has crumbled and descended into a form of barbarity. Or you can choose to study and include in your narrative that of the culture of the Mozarabs and the Saracens and their continuous interaction and the movement of manuscripts between the two. And we can go on, and even if you are talking about Western political theory and you're talking about the idea of original conditions and social contract, you can choose to include the Hayy bin Yaqzan and his imagination, or the work of Ibn Fadlan, or Sahrawardi and his notion of natural good and natural justice, or the works of someone like Mullah Sadr, who talks about intuitive justice, and the role that all of that played in creating the cultural milieu for Thomas Aquinas and later on for people like Locke and Rousseau, or you can choose to jump over it as entirely irrelevant. It's a choice of what world you want to construct, and whether your primary response is one of being threatened by the points of meeting intention or being assured that human beings ultimately must search for commonalities, find them, and if they cannot find them, then for God's sake, invent them. The Islamophobes of today purposely, again, in the choice of narrative, they'll ignore the fact that, as Deborah Higgs Strickland in her work, a fascinating book called Saracens, Demons, and Jews, which she demonstrated how Jews and Muslims and demons became the folk monsters of a whole tradition within Europe, and the image of the monster and the image of what invokes fear. They think that they can today differentiate, say, well, the demon is Muslim but not the Jew. The demon is this but not that. But as anyone who's dealt with the spooky and the haunted knows, has anyone encountered the real ghost? Once the evil spirits are in, nothing less than a violent exorcism can really close the door, and only God knows if that will work. Most often exorcisms don't. Thank you very much for your patience. I really do appreciate it.
We have time for a few questions. We have a microphone here at the level of the aisle on this side of the room. If you'd like to approach the microphone, Professor Abou El Fadl will be happy to respond to a few questions. Yes, go ahead.
Professor, you mentioned John Makdisi and his work on the Islamic origins of the common law, and about how he kind of traces it back to the idea of the waqf and of the Act and things like that. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about how that came to be, and tell us a little bit more about what kind of, implications that has for our current debate on Sharia here in American jurisprudence.
I don't believe in historical inevitabilities. Honestly, my understanding of John Makdisi's work, first, there's George Makdisi, the father, and John Makdisi, the son, and a lot of times they're confused. George Makdisi maybe was more expansive. The father was more radical than the son in some of his claims. Radical in a good way. Radical is good in my dictionary. It's not a bad thing. John Makdisi basically argued that common law, the institutions of Inns of Court, played a critical role in the development of the common law and in creating the autonomous or quasi-autonomous legal judiciary that saw itself as the enforcer of the custom of the people and the spirit of the people. And that without the development of the Inns of Court, the very idea of a law that exists outside the of absolute in absolute subjugation to the state would have been absent, because in Roman law, after Justinian came and destroyed all the variant articulations of Roman law and unified it in the Justinian Code, the state owned absolute monopoly over the definition of law, and that was very difficult for many of the common law countries with their tribal and feudal structures to follow. So anyway, and John Makdisi and others have argued that, well, basically, the idea of the Inns of Court, clearly we can trace it to the direct effect or the works of people like Abelard and Henry II, and the experiments of Henry II with the British legal system, and then we can, and in fact, one of the most fascinating things is that some of the manuscripts that played the biggest role in transmitting these cultural institutions, although the original Arabic copy is long lost, the Latin copy, which exists in many museums, still maintains many of the phrases translated literally from Arabic, because the translator didn't know what belonged to the original Latin as to what belonged to the Arabic edition. So for instance, a lot of the Latin copies in the legal field that played a huge role in the legal field will have the expression in the name of God, the most merciful, the most compassionate, translated literally to Latin. And you read it, and if you know something about it, you say, oh, well, we know where that comes from. That comes from Muslim culture. But the medieval archivalist thought, okay, well, that's what the text says, and I'm going to just translate it literally, and so on. So I'm not sure that John Makdisi, and I personally would not claim that the origins of the common law are Islamic, and I don't believe in historical triumphalism. I don't believe in that it is that anyone can have a clear narrative of triumph in all civilizational values. Civilization, by its very nature, is what makes it a civilization. What makes it civil is that it appeals to a broad array of humanity, and if it didn't, it would have never qualified for the very concept of civilization. And so the point is, narratives that search for commonalities, points of transfusion and transplantation, and that does not see the world in terms of an ongoing conflict, but sees the world in an ongoing conversation and discourse between various human groups. I'll give one final example, and then I'll shut up. One of the people, I don't want to name him because he's a colleague of mine at UCLA, who wrote one of the very influential books of Western triumphalism, and books that talks about the confrontation between Islam and the West, and how the West, having the superior civilizational values, was ultimately victorious, etc., etc. And I was in conversation with him, and I mentioned something about Islamic studies, and he said to me, well, actually, I don't know anything about Islamic culture. And to my mind, how in God's name did you write your triumphalist work? How can you claim triumph over the other if you don't know the other? Because maybe if you knew the other, you wouldn't see things in a simple history of triumphalism. Just the way it is.
Another question?
Professor, I study political science and women's studies here. And I just want to know what you think of the tradition of both the West and of Islam in terms of their differential treatment of women and their treatment of gender, something that comes from a religious tradition and also makes its way into our legal system.
Well, you know, being once, well, I guess once you always are a brother. I have a sister. and having a wife, I am a complete believer in the inevitability of patriarchy. Men, maybe God's curse upon us, we tend to dominate and oppress women by our nature. My wife has convinced me of that. And she's right. I don't believe, I mean, listen, there's a book, actually, I might have jotted it down, because of course I've delivered only about 3 pages of my 16-page lecture, as always happens, but you know. Okay, this is a typical sample. Jacqueline de Wever, that's right. Sheba's daughter, demonizing the Saracen women in medieval French epic. There's another book that I had read a couple of years ago about demonizing the Saracen, by the way, is a Muslim, is what Muslims, one of the names for Muslims. About the image of the Muslim woman or the Saracen woman in Crusaders' literature. And remarkably, Crusaders in medieval world, which, I mean, any historian would think of the patriarchy in medieval Europe as remarkably oppressive of women. Well, in crusading imagery and in the imagery of the Reconquista as well, the demonizing of the Saracen woman was for being promiscuous and sexual and frequenting things like bathhouses and being explicit about her sexual desires and so on. And then I'm very mindful of the memoirs of Lord Cromer when ruled Egypt, or many of the French scientists when they entered Egypt and they invoked the image of the oppressed women. So what is shared and what is common and what I think cannot be doubted is the oppressions of patriarchy. And that cautions every Muslim to re-examine the Islamic law and Islamic legal doctrine, especially as it emerged from periods before we could speak freely about the institutions of patriarchy, and see what remains or what does not remain godly in it, or consistent with divine justice and divine goodness. But I do not believe and find no historical evidence that one group of men by their nature are consistently more oppressive of women than others. All men seem to excel in that job across the board, everywhere.
Another question?
In your introduction, it was mentioned that you were a critic of puritanical or Wahhabi interpretations of Sharia and Islamic law. What are some specific points of criticism that you would raise, and specifically what types of sources would you turn to for citation and refutation of that specific school of interpretation?
You know, I have to, I was once lecturing at the University of Cairo, and a young gentleman got up and said, can you prove to me that, what is your evidence that the United States is a real democracy? How do you answer a question like that? First I'd say read my book, The Great Theft, or at least one of my books, to know what systematic critique I have against Puritanism. In shortcut, what I mean by puritanical is something very specific. I don't mean pro-Western and anti-Western. I don't mean pro-Israeli or anti-Israeli. I don't mean whether I agree with the law or not. What I'm referring to is is an attitude towards divinity. A school of thought, which I describe as puritanical, believes that the divine normative imperatives, the divine, what we call in Islamic law, taklif, the obligation that comes from divine goodness, can lead to a determinative social order. In a puritanical thought, that determinative social order can be complete and whole and total, and can in itself be divine. So divinity can transcend from the taklif, from the obligation that comes from God, to the human institution that results from the engagement of, the comprehension of, and the implementation of of that obligation. That I find theologically extremely problematic. I believe that the divine obligation can be engaged, and in my own system of belief, I believe it should be engaged. I believe that divine obligations elevate human beings, but I do not believe in the divinity of any social order that is mitigated or mediated by human beings. And I do not believe that the divine obligations intended or were intended or in any way inevitably lead to a determinative social order that is complete. That many of the divine, the engagements with the divine obligations are engaged the realm of the conscience. So it is, to put it bluntly, I don't believe that as a state or as a male I have jurisdiction to interrogate a woman or any woman about how she dresses, or about any man or woman about whether they pray in the mosque or not. It doesn't preclude me from having my own views, and if it doesn't preclude me as a man, if I want to decide to wear the veil tomorrow and compete with women in that field, that's up to me, between me and God. But human jurisdiction is one thing, and a divine engagement and the space for conscience is another thing. I'll tell you, I'll turn your question into, you always answer the question that you want to answer and not the question that you actually asked. Academics excel in this, and lawyers especially. These are the highest paid lawyers. And I'll tell you, one of the reasons that I intensely dislike Islamophobia and people who dwell in hate and fear and anxiety is that they make my world infinitely more complicated in having an honest to God discourse with my fellow Muslims. When I have to constantly fear that whatever criticisms I leverage in order to elevate the moral condition of fellow Muslims, I have to constantly worry about this criticism being hijacked, stolen, and misdirected in order to degrade Muslims. That hampers whether consciously or not, whether I want it to hamper or not. That throws all types of difficulties before me as I try to formulate my discourse. So the other thing is, as a matter of human dignity, and I refuse to play the role of what some scholars have called, quite accurately, the native informant. The native informant who's brought about by a dominant power. You bring a native in to testify to the badness of the native. to fellow natives. So you bring the native in who says, yes, we are exactly as the supreme power says we are. We're backwards, we're stupid, we're retarded. We need the dominant power to liberate us from ourselves. The native informant is a morally reprehensible function. And the fact that I have to, in my own work, as I try to be an honest-to-God critic within my tradition, try to navigate my world so I am never end up playing the role of the native informant, where I am celebrated by the powerful and despised by the weak, because I only help the powerful oppress the weak more effectively. I can't live with that. And I would rather shut my mouth forever than play that role. And that's exactly why Islamophobia is a pain in the you-know-what for people like myself. It neutralizes much of our effectiveness, because the essence of Islamophobia is that it sees this tradition as fundamentally and inherently flawed and non-fixable without an act of ultimate abandonment and refutation. While people like myself see this tradition as inherently good and moral and praiseworthy, and that it is part of its healthy process of rejuvenation for it to critique itself and to reconstruct itself and to reinvent itself in an ongoing process in engaging not just with the self but with the other. So I'm not troubled at all that we look at the world and we see that the world has reached higher levels of honoring women or honoring minorities or fulfilling the rights of this, and we learn from that that we as Muslims need to do a better job in fulfilling these moral obligations. It's part of God's creation. It's why God created diversity, to teach us through the experience of one another.
One more question?
Hi, Professor. Thank you for coming. I was wondering if you believe that democracy and individualism, as is put forth by American policy and politics, if that inevitably leads to moral degradation and secularism, or if a society can remain God-fearing in large while being democratic and individualistic. Thanks.
You know, one of my teachers, Sharia teachers, Islamic law teachers, used to say he had never attended a Western university. He's always been a student of the seminary, Azhar, never spoke any language other than Arabic. And he used to tell me, you know, I don't know if I'm a Democrat or not. I don't know if I believe in democracy or not. All I know is that I lived under autocratic rule, and I've seen the amount of corruption that results from autocracy, and whatever can lead to the opposite of that, I believe in. And ultimately, I mean, what do we mean by democracy? And I'm not just playing, you know, academic games. I have read enough democratic theory to know that, you know, on the one hand, you've got what I personally do not find very attractive, the whole discourse about that democracy needs an overlapping consensus, and the only overlapping consensus is civic virtues, and civic virtues cannot accommodate religious commitments because religious commitments are by their nature exclusive and non-inclusive and so on. I don't find that persuasive, and I don't find that necessary for the theory of democracy. I think this rises from fundamental flawed approaches within communities of faith. I think that religion can uplift the moral discourse within a democracy if it is very conscious of the fact that to the extent that democracies follow the will of the majority of people often disbelieve in God and often do awful things, and therefore a democracy needs a level of absolutism, and this absolutism is known as rights. constitutional rights that are unwaverable, not subject to the whims of the majority. Now, does this necessarily lead to the type of amoralism or hedonism, alienation of the individual that Charles Taylor describes in his book, The Secular State, for instance, or that Harvey Cox predicted, erroneously, I should add, in his famous work about secularism? I think the problem is greatly hampered by the history of those who excelled in inventing the institutions of democracy. Because for better or worse, the history of Europe has gone through a period of anti-religiosity that I think was frankly ungrateful to many of the virtues that ended up being essential to constitutional orders. And a level of skepticism that did more damage than good in the protection of the very fabric of the democracy thought. Now, can we chart a course other than that which has been charted by Western Europeans? I tell you, when I visit countries in Eastern Europe, I see a very different dynamic. When I see communities of faith within democracies, like this one, or some in particular in religious communities in Europe, I see a dynamic. I see people who fervently believe in democracy, fervently believe in individual rights, but whose moral prism is not individualistic, it's communal. They don't believe that, it's me first and me last and look after number one and all that nonsense. They really do think in terms of I should look after myself, but I should also look after others because that's the decent and godly thing to do. You can see that I mean, Egyptians are going through this debate right this moment. We have a group of intellectuals who want to banish religion out of everything so that they will have a democracy. They argue that Egypt must be a-religious in order for Egypt to have a real democracy. I don't belong to that camp. I think it is very flawed. And when we don't believe in a deity, which in my convictions is a real deity, we tend to deify ourselves. And there is nothing more dangerous than a deified human being. Robert Unger gave a lecture saying, I admire what religion does, but I think humans should overthrow God. And in all niceness and politeness, I said, I was sitting next to him at dinner, and I said, between a divine you or a divine gentle God that I can go home to, I choose a gentle God I go home to. The idea of you God, it doesn't really appeal to me. And he looked at me very puzzled, and he said, but you can be God too. And I said, but what happens if I really don't believe like I am a God, and you do, and then you have I actually intentionally used the word chutzpah, to then dominate me and subjugate me. And he said, well, that's your fault. I said, well, therein is the error of all moral philosophy that has existed in my essential critique. He looked at me with absolute disdain and stopped talking to me for the rest of the night.
Professor Abou El Fadl, thank you very much.
You're welcome.